My name's James, and I paint minis.
This is Spoontastic Minis. So in the previous couple of videos on pre-shading, I showed you how to do pre-shading for the main armour colour on a Space Marine. But pre-shading doesn't have to be just for the main armour colour, you can use it for details as well, so let's show you some of that. To that end, we're going to pre-shade the green glow area on this Necron Royal Warden, and I'm going to start with the same black grey that I started with on Space Marine, just to go over these bits that currently have been dry brushed with lead belcher from the Games Workshop. And just like before, I'm going to establish a full gradient of a range of greys, slightly different greys in this case. I'm going to major on slightly bluish greys to give it a more cold clinical look, but the principle is the same, that we start with most of the area black grey, and then we do a smaller area in the next grey and a smaller area in the next grey, and so on until it's pretty much white. Now I know there'll be some people watching this video saying, oh, you could have just painted Tesseract Glow over the lead belcher pipes. Yep, I could have done, but there's two things about that. Not everything was actually caught with lead belcher, such as the spheres on the gun, and also that it wouldn't look as good. I've had several people commenting, how did you get Tesseract Glow to look that good on Instagram? So I'm assuming I did something right with this, which is largely due to the pre-shading, because of course the Tesseract Glow was just one layer of Tesseract Glow over this pre-shade. So this step is the spheres on the gun. It might seem slightly redundant, but it is actually lighter than the blacks around, and I am leaving a bit right in the recesses that is black. In theory, the Tesseract Glow would also make that green, but it would be extremely dark if it does. Now, unlike with the pre-shading Space Marine video, I am going to show you pretty much every step of the way on this, mainly because the area that I'm shading is actually quite a bit smaller, and so there is actually less work to do than the entire main armour colour, but obviously you do have to take care and attention over where the paint goes, because more of this model is actually painted at this point. The other thing that's slightly different to the Space Marine is you'll notice I'm pretty much painting every inch of this in the black grey, so it won't actually have completely black recesses, but this is because I've noticed where people paint Tesseract Glow, generally even the darkest recesses do have some slight colour to them, so rather than going completely black, the black grey is actually going to be the darkest colour. Now, I had an idea to do the green glow on these sort of cloak pieces. I know a lot of people just paint them bronze and forget about them, but I thought if they appear to be black stone with little glowing green bits in them, that would actually look cool. Unfortunately, this means I've actually got to pre-shade each one of these round pieces, so we're just painting them with black grey to start with. Easy to forget these tubes and sort of guts stomach area, for lack of a better term, for this Necron. But there are glowing tubes here, as well as the eyes that also need to be painted. Now that that's had a good half hour to an hour to dry, we're moving on to a slightly lighter shade of grey, which is Dark Reaper from the Games Workshop. This is a slightly blue or cool grey compared to the one that went before, and this should give it a more clinical look, whereas on the Space Marine we used Skaven Blight Dinge, which was a much warmer looking grey. But I think this will actually fit the green glow much better. So the idea here is to paint a smaller area in each of the areas we've already painted. So you find I'm painting part of the tube and part of these spheres, rather than the whole thing. Now, one thing I did try to do with these particular tubes here was not have the whole thing just shaded. I noticed on some of the models that I'd seen that I liked more, it sort of went lighter and darker as the tubes went along, suggesting maybe the power was moving down the wire or what have you. So I decided to paint them so that basically it's pretty bright towards where it meets the gun, and it's a little bit bright towards where it meets the base of the spine, and otherwise it's going to be fairly dark in the middle. But there will be a fairly long lead in and out of that. You'll see more of what I mean as this goes along, but as we get lighter and lighter you'll see it gets shaded more and more towards those two ends rather than the middle. I realised last time I didn't actually film painting the eyes. I assure you I did paint the eyes with black grey, and I do go through all of these stages. It is a little difficult because you've got to be careful to make each stage smaller than the last stage, which isn't super easy, but it can be done. Same sort of idea with these circles on the cloak area. You're just trying to paint a smaller circle than what went before, and hopefully it'll get lighter and lighter and lighter until you get to the lightest greys, and then you're ready for the Tesseract Glow afterwards. Just for clarity, I only showed 2 rows of these earlier, but I did actually do all of them, because I think once it's done it will actually look quite good. Now on this one I'm going to do a little extra step, which is arguably optional, which is edge highlighting. Dark Reaper is an ideal edge highlight colour for black. So you'll see here I'm actually doing the edges of these black stone pieces anywhere where I think it might catch the slightest bit of light, such as the edges, the top edges, and of course the bottom part of the circle cut out for the bits that are going to glow. So we're just going over those ideally with the side of the brush. If I can't get the side of the brush in contact, I use the tip, but that's a little bit more difficult. This step is of course optional, but I think it's worth doing if you want your model to look really good. I don't go through and do every single grey with this. The Dark Creeper is generally enough to see that it's edge highlighted a little bit, but just enough to pick out the details and show actually there is some highlighting going on. Now the edge highlighting only really applies to the black areas, which is mainly the cloak that I'm picking out and of course the gun. And I am somewhat filling in details, mostly on areas where I think they catch the light or surfaces where it would catch the light. They will see me occasionally sort of making up a slightly chunky highlight in some areas where I feel it would catch the light, but it doesn't necessarily have a specific edge to pick out. This technique doesn't require anything particularly special in the way of brushes. I'm using an S layer brush from the Games Workshop here, but you could use any reasonably fine tip brush that you like. The trick is really not to get too obsessive, just you use it on the upper edges. You know, you don't have to go around, say like this rectangular section here, I'm going over the top and a little bit at the sides, that's it, you don't have to do the bottom. So don't go too crazy, but as long as you go over most of the raised edges, it'll look like it's properly highlighted. Now, as a general rule, I don't recommend edge highlighting for beginners, as you have to be very careful about the width of the lines and where exactly you place them. But I am showing it as part of this video because it is something I naturally did at this stage, as I had the right colour at the right consistency, and as you can see, it is taking me a few minutes, but it is only a few minutes work to do this. I like to think that you can already see that the body of the gun looks more highlighted and looks a bit cooler than the other bits of the gun, like the barrels that are currently just completely black. And so you can see why I'm doing this in the first place. Now there is one area that I also want to focus on for doing edge highlighting, which isn't so much about edge highlighting so much as the glow effect, which is actually the barrels of the gun. You see where we have these spheres, obviously the area away from the spheres you're just edge highlighting normally, but the area that has the spheres, those are going to glow. So if you have the nearby edges picked out as well, then what you'll find is when you apply the Tesseract Glow, if you deliberately overlap slightly with picked out edges, it will appear that nearby areas are also glowing slightly. And so that's what I'm going to do in a moment. So you can see here I'm highlighting pretty much the full area around these glowing spheres. Now I wouldn't normally do this if I were just edge highlighting this barrel and it was just meant to be, you know, a black barrel. I'd only do the bits that I felt were naturally catching the light, but because these spheres glow, they would be illuminating the nearby gun barrel. Even if it's meant to be very dark black, you'd still see the edges lighting up slightly. And I will deliberately overlap later on with the Tesseract Glow paint so that it actually looks like it's a very slight glowing effect. Don't forget to do this on the back of the gun barrel as well, because as you can see it is clearly visible from both sides. Right, that pretty much concludes our slight distraction with edge highlighting. Just doing the last couple of bits and then we'll move on to making the pre-shaded areas a little lighter with some uniform grey from the Army Painter, which is a neutral mid-grey colour. Now, much like with the previous video, every time I paint a lighter grey, it has a tendency to look much brighter than it really is under these lights, because of course it is lighter than the previous colour, it's just not particularly bright. This is a mid-grey, not a light grey, but it looks almost white under these lighting conditions because it is lighter than the surrounding area. The trick here is really to get not only a uniform thickness of line, which is something that I'm struggling with, but also to paint a smaller area than what's gone before so that there's a nice graduation between lightest and darkest areas. The circles here don't have to be perfect, but you are only trying to occupy about 50%, maybe less, of these orbs, so that again it's getting lighter and lighter but also smaller and smaller as you go along. You may find switching to a smaller, finer tip brush helps as you go along. Just bear in mind that it won't hold as much paint and it will dry much quicker on a fine tip brush than it does on a much larger brush with a larger belly. That is the technical term. Now, I've had a lot of questions, particularly on Instagram, for how did I get the effect where these wires are lighter in some places and darker in others. Well, you can see a lot of it happening right here. You see how towards the brass looking thing on the end, I'm actually putting a lot of this mid-grey colour. but further down it will get less and less, so it will actually get darker as the wire goes along, and then right towards the base of what I'm calling a spine, for lack of a better term, we'll actually highlight it again, so there'll be a big portion in the middle where it's dark, and then towards each end it will be lighter. This might see a little laboured, like I'm taking a lot of time over this. It's mainly to get the line thickness uniform along these power lines or whatever they are, just to make sure it's not sort of weaving up and down as the highlight goes along it. You could do that deliberately for an effect, but as I'm not particularly trying to, I don't want one highlight to have that and the rest not, because it would just look a little strange. And I've suddenly remembered the back of the gun that also needs highlighting. Fortunately, I had done this with the previous colours, so it was only for this colour that I suddenly noticed it, like, oh, I meant to highlight that earlier. Now, as pointed out before, I will not be using this colour to add to the edge highlighting. Not only would this be very time consuming, but it would actually add very little extra to the look other than raising the amount of visible contrast on the black parts. And it would only really be a slight highlight to a slight highlight. So I don't view it as particularly necessary. Maybe if I was going to enter this in some kind of competition I would, but other than that, I don't think it's worth the effort really. Now, as you can see with this cloak, this follows the same principle as the spheres on the gun, but of course these are flat, whereas the spheres are three-dimensional, sort of half spheres if you like. So it's actually more difficult to paint these because you've got to paint a pretty exact circle that's smaller than the previous two circles you've already painted, so do be careful with this step. And finally, the tiniest dots of all need to go in the eyes. This does pay off later when you see the eyes have a nice graduated effect and a glow effect. Now, having let that dry, We now move on to the even lighter ash grey, which is the lightest of the greys I'm going to be using. It will look almost white under these conditions, but I assure you it is a light grey. We're starting in exactly the same pattern with this large tube on the gun, which I'm sort of using to gauge the effect, to judge how much or how little I have to paint over the other parts, and then moving on to other parts nearby, which now have to be done quite delicately to make sure they have only a slight bit of ash grey painted in the middle. You will find that these clips are getting shorter and shorter and shorter because of course each stage requires less area to be painted, so generally they go by a little quicker. Now we're moving on to the tubes, and we're really building on what we've already painted here. So if we painted a small area, we have to do an even smaller line, and then like on this tube, if we painted a very big area, it still has to be a smaller area that we paint this time, but we've actually got a lot more scope for applying a large long line of colour. It might seem a bit weird to be painting the wires so low down where you think they'd somewhat naturally be in shadow, but bearing in mind that this is going to be a source of light in itself, so it is actually going to be illuminating the surrounding area rather than being lit from above like a normal part of the model would be. And finishing off with a tiny dot in each eye. Bear in mind there are some bits like on the back of the gun or the tubes around the guts area that I have painted, but I'm not necessarily recording every single brushstroke on camera. So with ash grey dry, we finally move on to a very small highlight with silver grey from Vallejo. This is an off-white that is almost white, but it's not quite there, so you could highlight all the way to white if you wanted to, but that would be an additional colour. Now for some of these parts this does get really tricky because it is a really, really tiny dot you're trying to apply, or a tiny thin line that you're trying to apply depending on the shape of the part. So you may find me taking my time over this a little bit. Now finishing off this pretty massive pipe that is going to need a fair bit of highlighting, but again this needs to be a very thin line in the middle of the ash grey coat and not go all the way along it, part of the way along of course, but it is now a much thinner line and I have to be very careful not to go over the edges. Incidentally, if you are trying to follow along and you do go over the edges, it's not that difficult to correct. You just have to go back in with the relevant colour and paint over it. Of course, if you make a big mistake, you would have to go all the way back to the darkest colour and then build it up again. So try to be careful when doing this. And the brightest highlight has a speck in each eye, which I think you'll find will reward us later with a very bright and intense looking eye. Now that's it for the greys. That is fully pre-shaded, just as the Space Marine was before, and now we're going to use, on all of these areas that we just did in grey, the technical paint Tesseract Glow from the Games Workshop. Now I have given this a very thorough shake, as some of you may have seen in my TikTok videos, and now it is a green that we're just going to paint straight on to all these areas, covering absolutely every part of what we've already painted. Now as this goes along, what you should gradually see is that the glow paint isn't actually doing terribly much. Most of it's coming from the pre-shading work that you've already done. So when you paint over something, the darker bits you painted in the dark greys are dark and the lighter bits are much brighter. Now working on these tubes, you'll see that I get this pretty much everywhere, including in the recesses, which initially looks wrong because of course it looks much brighter, but as it dries it mutes down. So you'll actually find, although I do have a bit of Tesseract Glow in the recesses, it does actually dry looking correct. So it's a dark green rather than completely black afterwards. I hope you can see though that already in just a few brush strokes, because it's already been pre-shaded, this is actually lighting up in different areas, as some being much lighter and some being much darker. So all of the hard work's already done. All you need to do now is make sure that the Tesseract Glow is just painted on every part of these glowing parts so that there's no gaps, that's all. Now I did say I was going to try painting these circles on the sort of cloak type thing. I haven't actually seen anyone do this, but it seemed appropriate to have these made out of black stone with glowing green circles in the middle. And though it is a little bit repetitive to do, it actually worked out quite nicely, I think. Now in theory, if you do go over the edges doing these, you should only hit either the completely black recess or the edge highlighting below, which will actually just make it look like it's glowing slightly. So actually this is much more forgiving than it looks like. It looks like I'm being super careful having to hit exactly the circle and no more, but actually you can be fairly generous with this and it'll still look right. Now for the bit which initially seems very tricky, because I'm just trying to paint the eye itself, but then I realised that actually if I can flood the surrounding area like the eye socket, it'll then look like the eye in the middle is glowing. So it's actually alright to put a load of Tesseract Glow in here, and then when it dries, although it looks ridiculous for a moment, it will actually look like the eye is glowing, being slightly reflected by the nearby metal. Now this is arguably an extra step, but I am just adding a bit of Tesseract Glow on all those Dark Reaper bits around some of the bits that I deem to be glowing and illuminating the nearby area, such as the spheres on the gun, and I'm also going to do a little bit on the sort of cloak area near the spine where the tubes are glowing. I'm not obviously going to do this on every inch of the model, and obviously a glow effect can be made to be more or less dramatic. This will be quite a subtle effect. It's only going to affect a very small area near bits that are supposed to be glowing. The goal here is to basically paint over the Dark Reaper area, but you're actually trying to paint a slightly thicker line than you did before, so it's actually a bit easier, so that part of it touches the black and make sure that it completely overlaps with the edge highlighting that you did earlier. Obviously any surfaces nearby, any glowing tubes, spheres or anything need to have just a little bit of Tesseract Glow on them for a very mild glow effect. So obviously that's what I'm doing here. It is a very minor version of the effect, so I'm not going too crazy about it. It's something that I thought would actually add to how the mini looks. I'm also doing a little bit on the sort of brass looking parts, but again nothing too crazy, just where the pipes meet the brass, if you like. Same sort of idea at the base of the spine on the metallic parts, but then also on some of these blackstone parts. Only the ones nearby, and I'm not going completely crazy about it, but obviously if they're really close, then obviously they would be naturally illuminated by the nearby glowing pipes. And same again on the back of the gun, exactly as we did before, a slightly wider line over the Dark Reaper edge highlights that we did, which is one of the reasons why I showed you doing the edge highlights in the first place. This isn't a video about edge highlighting, it's just this is part of the Tesseract Glow effect that I'm trying to show you with pre-shading. And finally, I'm hoping you can see this, I didn't actually forget the tubes at the guts. Although initially I did, I had to come back and do this. But I did actually get them in the end, so don't worry. There we go, that brings us to pretty much the end of the video about pre-shading details, in this case the Tesseract Glow effect on a Necron, by painting numerous greys to make them lighter and lighter, and then painting Tesseract Glow over the top, and this is what it looked like through a good lens once it was dry.
Right, if you've watched this far, firstly thank you for watching. I very much appreciate it. If you did like the video, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon to let you know when the next video will be coming out. I hope it will be soon.